Hey, welcome back to Into Deep, a podcast with me, Alyssa. In this podcast, we go a little too deep into everything feminism, from pink Pilates princesses to reproductive labor. Yeah. Every time I make an episode now, I'm like, hey, I'm back after 6 months. And that is what a master's degree does to your podcasting hobby. I wrote this episode like literally 2 days after my exam last Monday, but I couldn't actually record it because, as you might be able to hear, my voice sounds a little bad. It was even worse. If it could get even worse. I didn't have a voice 2 days ago. So this is probably the best it's going to get, and this is the only day I have to record this. So sorry if my voice, if you don't want to listen to this because I sound sick. But also I think a lot of people like the sound of like a sick voice. So maybe this will be my most listened to episode yet. Anyway, the topics of this episode are definitely things that I've been asked to talk about for a while and have been meaning to talk about as well, especially surrogacy. Like, I meant to do an episode on this probably over a year ago, but I just like never got around to it because I think there's so many lenses that you can sort of look at surrogacy through and combined with. And I was just thinking of like the right time to do it. And I feel like I found that with talking about the increase in disordered eating at the same time. Then also by proxy, I need to talk about the current state of fitness culture for women alongside like the eating disorder as a sex diagnosis, and also how we can go about abolishing surrogacy. And you'll see how all these things are connected in this episode. So get excited. For some more context, if you haven't been keeping up with celebrities, which like I'm jealous if you haven't, I need to delete Twitter, both for the Elon Musk reasons and for the fact that like I just don't need to know, like I don't care. There has been like a really flagrant display of celebrity anorexia becoming more and more obnoxious in the past few years. At the end of last year, actress Jamila Jamil posted a video about the stark weight loss in Hollywood. She says it is not body shaming to comment on the fact that there is a rapid rise of the aesthetic of emaciation. She points out that this isn't a trend just among young women either. When we talk about like eating disorders, they do most often occur in teenagers and young women. But in Hollywood, and especially on red carpets, this hasn't just been affecting the younger actresses and singers. For obvious reasons, there's a thin line between body shaming and calling out trends that are effectively killing women who are socially persuaded to take part in them, or more so socially oppressed to take part in them. And I don't want to like, by making this video, somehow end up on the side of like men who body shame women for being too skinny, even though they were the ones who told her to get skinny. But it is something that can still be commented on without calling someone like disgusting for being too thin. In any case, body shaming is realistically not routinely targeted against thin women, particularly when that is and has always been, at least in modern society, the beauty standard. And I feel like thin women only get body shamed when they're just called fat, even when they're not, or if after years of being socially persuaded, they actually do develop anorexia. Then they look non-sexual and disgusting. Okay. Across red carpets this year, there has been such a rapid increase in the amount of seriously anorexic female celebrities, or not even necessarily anorexic, but just like a really apparent rapid weight loss. Young women like Emma Stone, Ariana Grande, and Jenna Ortega, but also older female actresses like Demi Moore and Michelle Yeoh. There was a whole debate about Demi Moore actually recently when she was on the red carpet, as articles started posting about her toned arms. When in reality, she had very little muscle mass, but the only reason that you could see her muscles is because her body fat was so low. Especially in the case of someone like Ariana Grande, who has been like scary for months now, months and months, alongside that weird codependent relationship with Cynthia Erivo throughout the whole Wicked promotions. Like, I don't think anyone's ever gonna know what the fuck was going on there. But recently she just started like a world tour, I think, and there's been a lot of videos of her come out where like she doesn't she simply doesn't look healthy enough to be on a world tour. Like, I feel like that's something that requires a lot of energy, a lot of mental and physical health to do that. And she simply doesn't look like that should be something she should be doing right now. Well, some of the comments online about her are obviously judgmental. I mean, it's a woman, but I think a lot of people are more so worried about the way she looks, especially with her history that's been in the public eye. Like, she experienced a bombing at one of her concerts, had one of her ex-boyfriends die. Like, clearly she has struggled mentally for a long time. And now, obviously, she's very emaciated. It's most worrying that her management let her tour at all in this state instead of getting her, like, immediate and crucial medical help. I actually watched a video by Drew Gooden the other day where he was talking about the music industry just being broken, but he also went into, like, the predatory nature of recording labels and how they have, like, absolutely zero care for the people who are under their label as long as they're making money for them. And I think even in the case of someone who's as big as Ariana Grande, like, she still can't get away with the fact that she's always going to be making money. Like, they don't really care about her health. If she can still make money, no one's going to help her. But where do weight loss and surrogacy intersect? In 2014, Meghan Trainor released her single All About That Bass. You guys remember that one? An anthem about body positivity. This just in, she's no longer all about that bass, she's all about that GLP-1. So she stated that she lost weight after 2 difficult pregnancies and gestational diabetes, which are completely valid reasons, of course. But then for her most recent child, she opted to enslave a woman to have it for her instead. I feel like if I had experienced really bad pregnancies that had showed me how horrible pregnancy could be, my next thought wouldn't be, I'm going to make someone else do this for me, because it was so hard. Like, she was apparently suffering from exhaustion, panic attacks, and PTSD after the birth of her second child, but she was totally okay to potentially subject another woman to that. Potentially kill another woman so she could have a baby of her own. A third one, by the way. You don't need 3, you've already got 2. Like, back in, like, 2020, Rebel Wilson also lost a lot of weight then at the end of 2022, announced she had had a child via surrogate, citing a higher statistical chance of a successful pregnancy if she used another woman's womb. Okay, so if there's a low statistical chance of pregnancy working in your body, how do you know it's going to work in someone else's? Lily Collins is someone who has been open about struggling from eating disorders for a long time. Recently she did get even skinnier though, so that's worrying. But she is another celebrity that has used surrogacy to have a child for her. Neither Meghan Trainor or Rebel Wilson would be examples of celebrities who are, like, severely underweight or unhealthy, but it is interesting to see that for many celebrities there seems to be a worry about their own body as a reason for why they're opting to use a surrogate. Some of the reasons are entirely valid for not wanting to be pregnant. Like, any reason that anyone has for not wanting to be pregnant is a valid reason, of course. I don't think it's ever worth the risk if there are chances of complications, but that goes for all women. You can't offload the difficulty of pregnancy onto someone else because it would be too difficult for your body to go through. You simply just don't have a child if that's the case. Regardless, when you see so many celebrities enslaving surrogates to have children, with it becoming increasingly more popular as this sort of heroin chic hits the red carpet, you have to accept that a lot of them are doing it because they don't want pregnancy to affect their bodies, which is fine. However, that doesn't mean you can force another woman's body to be changed forever. Surrogacy is en route to becoming a status symbol. To not risk change to your own body, you can just use someone else's. At the same time, there's social powers in the West that make people care so much about how they're perceived, which is probably influencing the reason why a lot of women don't want to be pregnant in the first place, associated with, like, the social status that being thin grants. The focus of this episode is therefore a discussion of the female body through 2 different lenses, one being eating disorders and The aesthetic of emaciation, which acts as a social contagion in the West, many wealthy countries, compared with surrogacy, which is a forceful form of reproductive slavery, most often occurring to women in the third world. Now, of course, bodily preferences of women and therefore eating disorders have been forced onto women all over the world and all throughout history. But I am mostly focusing on the way that weight loss, eating, and fitness are occurring as trends in the Western world. Not only because that's where I most understand the culture behind it, but also because wealthy couples of the Western world are the ones most frequently using surrogacy. When discussing the beauty standards for women and the consistent pressure to be thin, a lot of men will cite the association of health and fertility to why skinny bodies are seen as attractive. However, the body expectations of women are most often not healthy ones. The ideal women as presented by Hollywood is currently not fit, is not muscular, is actually unlikely to be able to sustain a fetus at all, thus not very fertile. As women become increasingly liberated, there are many forces beginning to work against us, which I'm sure you have noticed and I've talked about before. The rollback of reproductive rights, trad wife content, and feminine energy are all things that I've discussed, but another form of trying to unliberate women, so to say, has been the push towards malnourished bodies. While the body positivity movement of the 2010s was never perfect, it was definitely better than starving women to death, which is what's happening these days. The push towards anorexia these days is just another form of fascism, keeping women as unable to fight back as possible, both physically and mentally. For many women who are experiencing eating disorders, the only thing they have the energy to think about is food, as their body attempts to fight starvation. Bo Pang writes in an article I'll discuss later. This self-regulation reinforces patriarchal norms, diverting women's energy and attention towards an unrealistic body standard and limiting their potential in other areas of life. Not to mention the effects of eating disorders are not always reversible. And this is most concerning because they most often occur in adolescents and young women. In terms of anorexia nervosa, long-term side effects include decreased bone mass density, leading to osteopenia or osteoporosis later in life, alongside a decrease in bone mineral density, which leads to a significant increase in fractures, including spontaneous fractures. 80% of patients with anorexia nervosa are also affected by cardiac complications. To have so many young women affected by these sorts of conditions associated with reduced eating is having like a whole generation of women who have experienced some form of eating disorder at some point in their life and are probably going to have long-term side effects from this. Does this not sound like some kind of like psyop to make women weaker and have health issues, which makes it more difficult for them to not only fight back physically, but also have the time and the strength to become more educated on feminist issues? And because this degree of malnutrition and emaciation is very difficult emotionally, physically, and mentally to reach, failure to live up to these standards is experienced by most women. And specifically experienced as an individual moral failing, which is obviously highly associated with other sex conditions like body dysmorphia and image issues, depression and anxiety, and overall a supremely low self-esteem and self-hatred. Even when it comes to those women who are anorexic, it's never enough, like they're never actually reaching a goal. It's just like continuous not eating until death, essentially. In a study by Podrowska et al., the researchers used data from the Wisconsin longitudinal study, which followed the life course of adults who graduated from high schools in Wisconsin from 1957 to 1993. The authors explored the associations between early socioeconomic disadvantage and how this affects associations of body mass and social status throughout lifetimes. While socioeconomic disadvantage at age 18 was strongly associated with a higher BMI and a greater risk of obesity at age 54, this relationship was much stronger in women. Not just a greater risk of obesity for women, but the associated obesity also induced even lower socioeconomic status for women later in life. This is unsurprising. Men are definitely socially allowed to be more fat than women as a general rule without it affecting the way that they're perceived. Low education, low income, and poverty are all consistently associated with higher BMI. All three of these factors are gendered and skewed harshly towards women on a global scale. This is commonly referred to as the feminization of poverty, discussed in early Total Woman Victory article by EDV, The Political Economics of Sex. Under a capitalist patriarchy, women of any class cannot simultaneously birth children and ensure subsistence without proximity to a man to support them financially. As Evie mentions, even women of wealthy nations can really only be rich without this proximity by remaining childless and single. Sociologist Joy Misra evidenced this by the notion that motherhood is now a greater predictor of wage inequality than sex. It's another connection between higher class, lower weight, and the ability to offload the labour of subsistence to women of the third world, namely through surrogacy. Eating disorders are thus experienced by women across ages, class, and race, but these experiences vary greatly. Speaking of total woman victory, the recent 2 issues discuss body politics, which surprisingly did not inspire this episode, but I will shout them out for doing it before me anyway. Specifically an article by Carafa titled "Sister, They All Want You Hungry, the Eating Disorder as a Patriarchal Weapon" discusses the politics of hunger, discipline, and forced femininity. Carafa defines the eating disorder as an inherently female diagnosis and, quote, one of the most sexually dichotomous psychiatric and medical illnesses. She writes, anorexia hysterica was first described as a disease occurring mostly in young women who wound up emaciated through hysteric apepsia, and was considered intertwined with the ever-classical feminine hysteria. There were also ideas that anorexia was potentially contagious, which, while maybe not by infectious means, it is definitely a social contagion to this day. As long as femininity has existed, the eating disorder likely has too. So I mentioned how a thin body is a feminine body. And I feel like people might see this as me saying that people who aren't skinny are unfeminine, and that's because they are. I've always talked about how femininity is just a form of oppression. Yes, fat women are seen as unfeminine, but so are women with any noticeable muscle. This is one of the reasons why I say femininity cannot be reclaimed or turned into something positive. It can't be like redefined either. It has like a very precise definition, which is created by men socially. Not everyone is feminine, and that's what it is sort of invented to be like, to force women to continually strive towards this femininity that they most often cannot reach. Women, me included, will strive for femininity regardless, because not being feminine often reduces your social status. Carafa writes, thinness becomes a proof of discipline and a marker of the female sex class condition. Meanwhile, the act of succumbing to hunger is cast as a symbol of indulgence, one deemed strictly unfeminine. This is another degree of why thinness is so feminized. It makes you out to be submissive and restrained, and more likely to be controlled. It's not just metaphorically either. The eating disorder has well-known neurological side effects, which I talked about. It like literally is a sign that you are the type of person who can be controlled by the sort of social factors that force women into having eating disorders, and alongside the neurological effects and physical effects, it altogether just makes you a weaker person. However, that shouldn't be experienced as an individual moral failing when everything in society is telling you that you need to be as thin as possible. As Carafa puts it, systemic starvation in the form of the eating disorder is merely another tool of the political incapacitation of the female. But as I mentioned, as the wealthy class and celebrities get thinner and thinner, the lower class keeps going in the other direction. This is pretty readily backed up by sort of the percentages of obesity and overweight people in most Western countries, which is just increasingly getting higher and higher. But even, for example, women who aren't obese but who have muscular bodies, even when women participate in sport, they often have to balance between a desire for genuine autonomy and empowerment, as the pressures of bodily aesthetics are pushed onto them. A great example of this is Serena Williams being the new face for healthcare company Ro, who were launching a GLP-1 weight loss drug similar to Ozempic, or the numerous other names that it's available under. Serena Williams, likely the best women's tennis player to have ever existed, literal like peak of her sport, probably doesn't need to lose weight. Realistically, she probably doesn't need to lose weight. Realistically, she's probably like one of the most fit people in the world. She was also playing that sport for 30 years almost after she turned pro in 1995 and only retired in 2022. But is also making her return this year at 44 years old. I'm sure there is a use for weight loss drugs for people who are experiencing obesity, but when it's being advertised by a woman who is very physically fit, it's definitely being more heavily associated with aesthetics than actual health. Most of the female celebrities I mentioned at the start of this episode did quote the use of GLP-1 medication for weight loss, but it wouldn't surprise me if even celebrity women who were not overweight or obese were still using these drugs to achieve and maintain a very thin frame. Ozempic is not the end-all drug of weight loss. For one, it's highly inaccessible when higher body weight is so heavily associated with lower socioeconomic class, and this is a very expensive drug. Most people wouldn't be able to afford it. But it also doesn't take into account the reason why people are fat in the first place, which is a combination of many factors, but a lot of them are due to this inaccessibility again. The lack of accurate nutritional and fitness education, with a lot of people only really having access to getting education from TikTok influencers who are always wrong, like 100% of the time, alongside the inability for most people to afford fitness infrastructure and the time to dedicate to fitness. The access to fitness or paying rights is structured by gender, race, class, income, ability, and location, among a million other things. Even when someone can afford Ozempic, that doesn't necessarily mean they're being given like the nutritional information and fitness education to be able to maintain that once they're off the drug. So it's really not helping at all. While conversations about Ozempic use and eating disorders are so inflated by the fact that they're done by the famous class, in reality, most of the general public are malnourished in a very different way. In Australia, 66% of adults are either overweight or obese, and this is only increasing. It's not surprising that there is so much advertisement for these very expensive weight loss drugs. All it's doing is taking advantage of this large percentage of the market. Quite obviously, the producers of GLP-1s don't care about the health of the population. I mean, there's still barely any research into the long-term effects of these drugs, but rather have noticed that if you can make a drug that over the half of the market want, you're going to make a lot of money from that. I'm going to go into this a bit further, how weight is a social status and often characterized as an individual moral failing and not often to do with health at all. Sometimes being fat as a woman can actually be a radical act, even if obviously being fat is never going to be associated with good health outcomes. That's just how it is. It can still be a radical act in kind of rejecting these sort of body ideals that are put onto women and being like, no, I'm just gonna be fat anyway, like fucking whatever. And I think Andrea Dworkin is quoted as one of the women who sort of was like, I am not fucking like living up to this feminine beauty standard. I'm just gonna let my body exist as how it is. So it definitely can be a radical act, but I think for a lot of women it's not really a choice. When they're experiencing obesity, it's more so associated with the socioeconomic factors and inability to access the means to become a healthy person. Any discussions about weight loss, eating disorders, obesity, etc. are incomplete without discussing the current state of women's fitness culture, which is bad and has always been bad and always rife with misinformation and just like literally it's always been bad. And as long as women are expected to look a certain way, it's going to remain bad. There was this article by the Australian Institute of Fitness titled How the Fitness Industry is Geared Against Women from the Start. And it starts by discussing how while we are still obsessed with thin bodies as a whole, women's fitness has shifted from how to get into a pair of size 6 jeans to how to squat yourself a peachier booty. Noticeably, when appearance is so important to your social existence as a female, anything that aims to change that body itself will be more associated with looks than actual health. But it's not just a social phenomenon that influences the way women work out, it's also in the design of gym equipment, the unwelcoming atmosphere of shirtless men grunting and screaming around you, and some weights just not even catering towards women at all. When I first started at the gym, I was at a women's only gym, which was great. And for some exercises, I did really light weights because I'd never been before. I'd never used my muscles before in that way. So obviously, I didn't have much and I needed to use really light weights, okay? When I switched to an all-gender gym, they didn't even have weights that light for a lot of things. I didn't need those weights anymore. But I can imagine if I had been to this gym first, I would have felt so discouraged by the fact that I couldn't even lift the lightest weight they had. It would make you feel like you literally were the weakest person alive, when there's probably so many other women who were just starting out who are also in the same boat. The only reason I swapped gyms was because I couldn't afford to go to the female-only gym anymore. This is another aspect of how low socioeconomics affect women's ability to lead healthy lives. Not only is food just expensive these days, just in general, literally who can afford a gym membership? Even if you do afford the gym membership, I personally refuse to go at busy times of the day because I am not waiting hours for some damn machine to like have a sweaty, shirtless, disgusting, ringworm carrying man to just cut in front of me. And why do no men bring towels to the gym? They sweat all over it and they don't even use like the free cleaning wipes to clean up after themselves. And they never get told off either. Like, that's literally a gym rule. You have to have a towel. No one says anything. It's actually fucking disgusting. Like, they're going to give me ringworm. So that further limits the amount of times that I can comfortably even use the facilities that I pay for. The fear of going to a gym, both of weightlifting, but also being around the sort of men that go to gyms, which 90% of them are disgusting, has, quote, created something of a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to women's fitness. More broadly, the extremely patronizing way women are catered to often leads to a skewed perception of what women's workouts should look like. I think a lot of people still think that men should do weightlifting and women should do Pilates for some genetic reason, when it's really just applying meaningless gender to fitness. There's even that fear, like, still sort of hanging around that resistance training and strength training for women will make you like bulky and massive and like roidy. Like, I wish. That's probably never going to happen for me. According to data from Fitness Australia related to fitness industry consumers, the amount of participants across genders is actually rather even, but the type of exercise we're doing is very different. This is where Pilates and cardio come in. There's always still a bigger focus on weight loss than strength gain for women. My sister got a body scan recently done at our gym, which might be pseudoscience in itself. Yeah, to confirm. But because she's been wanting to gain more muscle, the guy that works at our gym immediately told her that she needs to focus on weight loss, and also told her to eat less than her basal metabolic rate. He told a fully grown woman, to eat less than 1,300 calories a day, which is like actually less than what a toddler eats. Should I like tag him in the description so you guys can go like leave hate comments on his page? But obviously she was like, okay, like ignoring that, you freak. But what worried me is that this guy is probably saying this to any woman who gets a body scan, any woman who he might do like personal training for. Even if they're not focused on weight loss, he's still telling them that they need to eat less than their basal metabolic rate, which is the amount that your body needs to just like function normally. Which scares me because a lot of them might not have the nutritional knowledge to know that that is literally malnutrition. I also question whether he would say that to a man with the same amount of body fat percentage, or is it because he just assumes that all women are at the gym to look a certain way and not for health reasons or gaining muscle, and that all women need to be like, like skinny and low body fat percentage. Otherwise they're just like fat and need to get out of his gym. Back to Pilates. Don't get me wrong, I actually loved Pilates when I got to do it for free at my $12 a week gym. Now I pay fucking $24 a week and there's no Pilates room. I'm actually so pissed off about this. Why am I paying $24 for a week for like the smallest fucking gym in the world with a stupid gym owner who thinks women should eat 1,000 calories a day? Anyway, Pilates got really heavily associated with this specific aesthetic of the pink Pilates princess, which was referenced by Spotify in their Spotify Wrapped at the end of 2024. If you listen to female artists that year, like Taylor Swift, Sabrina Carpenter, Chapel Roan, or even Charlie XCX, it gave you a specific listening phase titled Pink Pilates Princess. This only confirmed the heavily gendered nature of Pilates. listen to female musicians and suddenly you're a pink Pilates princess. You're like feminine and you're soft and you can't lift like a bag of groceries. Yeah. It wasn't just Spotify referencing this though. Obviously they were referencing something that was pre-existing. It was this whole culture around Pilates that had developed at the time. And I think that's like sort of died down a little bit since, but it wasn't really associated with Pilates at all. It was rather an aesthetic of low impact exercise that was associated with femininity. Doing Pilates itself is already a measure of class because who can afford to go to multiple Pilates classes every week? Unless they're going to Revo Fitness with a free Pilates room. I miss it so much. $12 Revo Fitness, free Pilates room. It was never really about the exercise at all, but there was still this conflation of health and the associated aesthetic of being quite thin with not much muscle tone, and this sort of idea of like soft femininity and like fucking whatever else. And I feel like so many women were convinced to take part in this sort of thing, which I feel like in a way, like Pilates, if that's the only exercise you're doing, is almost like a waste of money to only be doing that without sort of weightlifting as well. Especially if you can like afford Pilates, then you can afford a gym membership. However, research actually shows that in terms of aging, resistance training is still the best method to ensure general longevity. Weightlifting places stress on bones, which is important to ensure bone mineral density and decrease the risk of osteoporosis later in life, particularly postmenopausal. Besides bone health, quote, resistance training has a favorable impact on women's health, including metabolic health, body composition, cardiovascular health, mental health, self-esteem, and body image. Something like Pilates often has such a specific bodily thin aesthetic that it hinders self-esteem and body image more than the exercise itself might actually help your health. As I was reading this Australian Institute of Fitness article, that seemed pretty like science-backed and scientifically minded as well. Suddenly they bring up the concept of training around your menstrual cycle. This is just another instance of pseudoscience that affects women's fitness, and I see people talk about it all the time. There is no real evidence that you have to alter your exercise routines to suit your menstrual cycle. In fact, there's much more backing to show that exercise reduces the negative effects of menstrual pain, fatigue, and mood impacts. Yeah, it might impact from week to week, like how, able you are to like do as much exercise. But there's actually no reason to be training around your routine or only doing low impact on like while you're on your period. There's actually like no reason to be doing that. People are trying to go back to these sorts of like natural ways of things, training around your menstrual cycle. Like, despite how like heavily gendered fitness is in the amount of pseudoscience around it, this article titled Evolution of Resistance Training in Women, History and Mechanisms for Health and Performance by William J. Kramer et al. actually notes that there's only really subtle physiological differences between men and women, which we know, really only due to testosterone and estrogen levels in the body. When it comes to things like muscle hypertrophy, there's really not that much different. Noting that women achieve measurable increases in strength, power, and athletic performance via engaging in resistance training programs of sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. Even the strength differences between men and women are often exaggerated or not using the appropriate groups for comparison. As muscle is deposited differently on male and female bodies, certain lifts such as a bench press, which is very difficult for women to achieve similar weights as men, is obviously something that's never going to be equal. However, when corrected for weight class, the strength differences are much less pronounced in other types of lifts. Another aspect that is not considered are the psychological and social factors that impact women's participation and adherence to resistance training programs. Women as a whole are obviously weaker than men, but women as a whole are also less focused on strength training. So if you're just taking, the average of women and men, that difference is going to be a lot more exaggerated than it might actually be if you correct the groups for weight and the amount that they train. Lifts such as deadlifts and squats, when corrected for that, are much more similar than you would initially think. But with resistance training actually becoming more popular in other forms of fitness as well, the fit body ideal is becoming, is sort of emerging as more socially privileged than the thin body. This article is by Bo Peng, titled "In the Name of Achievement, Women's Fitness Body in an Era of Positivity." She argues that unlike the anorexic aesthetic, the fit body ideal simultaneously embodies elements of self-sexualization and objectification while intertwining ostensibly positive discourses of strength, agency, and self-care with hidden mechanisms of control. The question is this new focus on gym girls and scrunch shorts really any better than the skinny aesthetic of the 2000s when it's just as focused on aesthetics over health? Peng asks, does this fitness ideal merely extend patriarchal scripts under the guise of progress, or might it actually offer a reconfigured pathway towards bodily autonomy? I feel like when you're thinking of the thin body ideal, especially in the 2000s, it was kind of a measure of social class, but it was also a measure of discipline and being able to ignore your hunger need and just not eating anything, becoming anorexic. Nowadays, the fit ideal is still an indication of discipline, but it also almost requires more social status to be able to afford a gym membership and afford all of these other sort of things that are associated with it. Peng writes, Fitspiration typically promotes an ethic of empowerment and liberation, health and wellness, and personal responsibility, yet often embeds unexamined discourses of surveillance and perfection. Akin to the thin ideal, it still cultivates body dissatisfactions, appearance anxiety, self-objectification, and assorted practices such as compulsive exercises, eating disorders, and orthorexia. The self-sexualization of resistance training is evident by how focused it is on the aesthetic that just happened to have changed over time. It's no longer focused on being really thin because having a big butt is now the aesthetic that everyone wants. It's not necessarily about health at all, but rather, again, just looking a specific way. Bo Peng discusses actually a lot of interesting concepts in this article. It's a really good read. She also discusses Michael Foucault's ideas of the disciplinary society and how the fit ideal is sort of forced onto people not through aggressive means, but through, again, social pressure. And again, it often doesn't have anything to do with actual health, but looking like you have the ability to upkeep this body through your access to money, nutrition, and fitness infrastructure and all of this. It's really just a social status to have this fit body. And again, it kind of is related to this idea about how if you're not fit, it comes across as an individual moral failing because you're not living up to these sort of social expectations, when realistically it's typically not someone's fault if they're not fit, especially if that reasoning is because they don't have access to the means to become a fit person. Obviously, women with children are going to struggle to maintain a fit body if they've had multiple pregnancies, and then they also have to take care of those children and their husband doesn't fucking do anything. So they have absolutely zero time. They have probably not much money because everything's going to their children. How would they ever be expected to maintain this sort of fit body? Moving on from these ideas about women's bodies, eating disorders, anorexia, and the fit ideal, I'm going to discuss the concept of surrogacy. But I felt like first we needed to have a look at its history. One of the earliest recorded instances of surrogacy is noted by Narendra Kumar and Jyotsana Chaudhary in their article published in the International Journal of Civil Law and Legal Research. They note that surrogacy has its roots in biblical times, namely in the book of Genesis. In the story, an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar is offered to Abraham on behalf of his wife, who is unable to conceive because she's 90 years old. This story clearly exists across all Abrahamic religions, and there are similar iterations in other cultures too. This quite obviously puts the roots of surrogacy quite firmly in the rape of lower class women. Obviously, for most of history before the advent of modern medicine, surrogacy came under a traditional form. This almost always would have included the rape of a lower class woman forced into carrying a baby that would have then been taken away from her. Thankfully, this doesn't seem like it was super common throughout history, until like the mid to late 1900s, wherein developments in medicine and social customs paved the way for modern surrogacy as we know it. Traditional surrogacy refers to the surrogate mother being impregnated either through rape or artificial insemination using the sperm of the intended father. In this case, the surrogate is the biological mother because the fetus is made using her egg. Gestational surrogacy instead involves IVF and the implantation of an embryo into the surrogate's uterus. This form of surrogacy effectively removed any legal complications for the intended parents and also worked in delegitimizing the meaning of any emotional connections by the surrogate mother. The concept of DNA linking parents to a child more than 9 months of growing that child in your own body is kind of like eugenicist, just basing the quality of offspring on DNA relations. And also, I don't know, it's just like such a focus on DNA and genetics and how that makes a child owned by you, when realistically, who grew that child? Like, who actually made the child into existence? The surrogate. However, gestational surrogacy, because of like the DNA relations, it's kind of made it so there's never any question about who the baby belongs to. And it means even if the surrogate mother wants to keep what is realistically her own baby, she has no right to keep it anymore. Surrogacy has been heavily debated for a long time. It's not just a recent thing that feminists are speaking out against it, but it is becoming more common nonetheless. In 2025, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls presented a report specifically on the manifestations of violence against women and girls in the context of surrogacy globally. Because commercial surrogacy is often illegal in wealthy countries, not America for some reason, which is a bit fucked up. The article notes that the practice of surrogacy is on the rise worldwide, but with a significant and growing proportion of arrangements involving cross-border dynamics. Intended parents, often from wealthier countries, engage surrogates in jurisdictions where the practice is legally permitted. Countries wherein commercial surrogacy is permitted is usually due to the fact that their governments are corrupt, poor, or there's just a general disregard or inability to honor human rights in that country. In 2023, the global surrogacy market was valued at $14.95 billion, but it is estimated to reach almost $100 billion by 2033. Even when surrogates are paid a large sum of money, not all of this will go to the surrogate herself, especially when it is a cross-border commercial surrogacy engagement. Often a lot of the money will go to the intermediaries. The report writes, surrogates have reported receiving as little as 10 to 27.5% of the total payment. I remember reading a while ago how little Kim Kardashian paid her surrogates to birth babies for her. In trying to like look up how much this was, I was met with titles like, Kim K's surrogate is pregnant, here's how much she might be making, and the ultra posh perks of being a celebrity surrogate. Another article suggests that a first-time surrogate costs about $30,000 to $35,000, while an experienced one costs around $45,000. I just calculated, I'm pretty sure it was reported that Kim Kardashian paid her surrogate $45,000. If you earn that as a surrogate, that is about $6 an hour for your whole pregnancy. The minimum wage in California, where Kim Kardashian is based, is $16.90 an hour. This is in USD. 24-hour, 9-month pregnancy without breaks, without paid leave, and also including having to go to checkups and do whatever else. And you're only paid like a third of the minimum wage to do that. And that's not even cross-border commercial surrogacy. Kim Kardashian's surrogate also was likely based in America. This is not a cross-border surrogacy situation. So it's not even like that money was worth more in a different economy. Like, she was literally just getting paid $45K, $6 an hour, basically, which is like a third of the minimum wage. Okay, so I don't really know how that's legal, but sure. Cross-border surrogacy is becoming the more common kind, and it often works through specific surrogacy agencies. While, as I mentioned, in the US, commercial surrogacy is legal, it's oftentimes more expensive. Those who want to save money and want to go lower, even lower than $30,000, which that's like... that's already way too low, but even they can't afford $30,000. But couples who want to have a child yet can't afford $30,000 will often go to the cheaper and less restrictive route of enslaving women in countries with lower economical expectations. The UN report notes that globally, most surrogate mothers come from lower income backgrounds and have less social status compared with the commissioning parents. Also, reportedly, migrant women are either specifically targeted for surrogacy or transferred to other countries for the purpose of impregnation and childbirth. For celebrity surrogates, they're often asked to move closer to the commissioning parents for the duration of the pregnancy. Similar to prostitution, people often use the argument that surrogacy is just like any other form of labor. What sets both prostitution and surrogacy apart from other forms of labor is the fact that they, quote, entail the direct and exploitative use of a woman's bodily and reproductive functions for the benefit of others, often resulting in long-lasting harm and exploitative circumstances. Surrogacy does not distinguish between working time and personal life. It's essentially slavery because the commissioned parents effectively own the surrogate's body, or at least her womb, for the duration of her pregnancy. Because she can't take time off, she can't quit because she's under a contract. She can't even keep the baby that she births at the end. The report importantly frames surrogacy as a form of violence against women globally and ultimately calls for the abolition of all forms of surrogacy. Abusive arrangements are enforced through the use of a contract, as I mentioned, with examples including surrogates being denied compensation if they miscarry. If they have a miscarriage, they're just not paid at all, essentially. Surrogates being required to waive their right to medical decisions or confidentiality, constant monitoring by intended parents, including via camera surveillance, restrictions on freedom of movement, or becoming dependent on surrogacy arrangements due to the surrogate's inability to find other work, especially while pregnant. Surrogate mothers are reportedly at a much higher risk of PTSD, anxiety, and post-birth trauma. Evidence also suggests that surrogate mothers have their health purposely jeopardized in an effort to ensure that the child is protected and produced. Surrogate pregnancies are more likely to be ectopic, require C-section delivery, and are more frequently associated with gestational diabetes, hypertension, preeclampsia, and placenta previa. If intending parents change their mind about wanting a baby, the surrogate is often forced to terminate the pregnancy under the claim that the fetus belongs to the commissioning parents, obviously, because they have similar DNA. So, it just ensures ownership. I feel like a lot of people don't talk about as well that abortion is like extremely painful. I'm not really sure how the healing process is from a surgical abortion, but if you're taking like the abortion pill, it's like extreme cramps for what can be like weeks, and a surrogate can be just like forced to go through that. And as I mentioned, surrogates are also often forced to waive any of their like ability to give medical consent or whatever that's just given by the commissioning parents. It's unsurprising that many women involved in surrogacy are under slave contracts or have been victims of human trafficking. Similar to prostitution, women's consent to engage in these forms of labor are often due to their inability to survive if they don't. There was a case last year out of Georgia where migrant women were discovered having been kept in confinement and forced to give up their eggs after being artificially stimulated to ovulate. Should probably clarify. Georgia the country, not Georgia the state. Essentially, every country that has legalized prostitution has then forced migrant women to partake in it when no other jobs are available to them. There's a reason why so many prostituted women in Australia are migrants from Southeast Asia. They literally don't have the ability to get another job, so are forced to turn to prostitution. That doesn't really sound like consent to me. Importantly, the report notes, while it has been argued that regulations and oversight can decrease the risk of trafficking of women and girls in surrogacy arrangements and overall reduce harm, existing evidence does not support such conclusions. The root of surrogacy is in the commercialization of women's bodies, which is the same with prostitution. It's also the reason why no ethical forms of either of these have ever been reached, no forms of them without harm or exploitation. That's why an ethical form has never been reached, because it's not possible. They're innately unethical. Not to mention the fact that the sale of children itself is a crime because it's considered trafficking, yet somehow the sale of a surrogated baby is not. Again, because of this like a weird eugenicist view of the ownership of children based on DNA. This isn't necessarily the sale of a child, but rather giving the child back to the parents that are, it belongs to, when realistically, like, who fucking grew that baby? Like, I think the baby is more belonging to the parent that actually, the mother who actually made it in her own womb. Yet when the baby is born and it is sold to the commissioned parents, somehow that isn't illegal like the sale of a child normally would be. The overall recommendation of this report is the global eradication of surrogacy as, quote, the practice of surrogacy is characterized by exploitation and violence against women and children. It reinforces patriarchal norms by commodifying and objectifying women's bodies and exposing surrogate mothers and children to serious human rights violations. Being a celebrity with access to literally everything in the world and still choosing to partake in something the United Nations has asked for the abolition of is really something. It's really a choice. There is another lens that surrogacy can be looked at through as well, and that is through racial politics and eugenics, as I've mentioned. In Laura Harrison's book, Brown Bodies, White Babies, she discusses the racial politics specifically of surrogacy. Fairly obviously, when it comes to surrogacy, it is usually higher class white couples hiring lower class non-white surrogates to birth babies for them. Before IVF, traditional surrogacy meant that the surrogate was the biological mother of the baby, meaning prospective parents would often search for a surrogate that matched the ethnicity, general appearance, education, and family history of their own. She writes, reproductive technologies, including surrogacy, are primarily used in a manner that reinforces the reproduction of the white, heterosexual, married, middle-class family. However, her book centers around the fact that brown bodies are being increasingly deployed in the creation of white babies. Harrison notes that oftentimes the lack of adoptable children is cited as a reason for assisted reproduction and the increase in surrogacy, but in reality, the number of children in foster care, many of whom become available for adoption, doubled between 1982 and 1999. The racial demographic of these children is to be expected. Most of them are children of colour, with many disabled children ending up in foster care too. Harrison writes, white infants are cast as a precious resource with a clear value for infertile couples, while others are perceived to be a drain on resources. Obviously, the politics around adoption are a whole other conversation, particularly in Australia, and the removal of Aboriginal children from their parents. But the desire to preserve whiteness and genetic similarity by those who use surrogacy is a good point. If you're someone who is willing to use surrogacy and forcing another woman to have a baby for you, I wouldn't imagine that you would have any ethical qualms with adopting, but clearly they don't want to do that, and that's for a weird reason associated with ownership. When reproductive technology furthered in the 1980s, there were a lot of varied reactions by feminist groups. In Right-Wing Women by Andrea Dworkin, unfortunately, she predicted the future of how surrogacy would go and the exploitation of women for reproduction. She wrote, motherhood is becoming a new branch of female prostitution with the help of scientists who want access to the womb for experimentation and power. While a technological perspective, this extreme is maybe yet to come to fruition. The forceful harvesting of migrant women's eggs in Georgia are a perfect example of how extreme reproductive technologies can go. Ideally, assisted reproductive technologies should have focused on actually assisting women in making pregnancy and childbirth less traumatic, rather than finding more potentially harmful ways to produce children. Not only this, but anti-surrogacy feminists overall argued that surrogacy could create a lower class of breeding women, arguing that, quote, surrogacy was alienating underpaid labour based on illegitimate contracts that exploited poor women's economic condition and reproduced sexual inequality. Feminists of this time were correct by this too. Multiparous surrogates are essentially forced into a breeder class when there is no way to exit this cycle of birth giving, especially when it's almost impossible to get another job while you're already pregnant. So overall, surrogacy is just like an evil form of reproductive slavery. However, there is a way that we can go about abolishing it and also reinterpreting surrogacy too. One of the worst and to me the most horrible reasons for why people choose surrogacy is because they want a genetic link to their child. It's always been like such a strange thing to me that you don't want to parent another human unless you have like a high percentage of similar DNA. I think if people were more educated about genetics, they would care less about this. The genetic similarity between humans is always like almost 100%. There's actually nothing that DNA does to link you to your children or parents or relatives besides the emphasis that capitalism has put on it. Another reason behind the sort of increasing desire for surrogacy around mostly gay male couples. Sorry, like if you're a man in a relationship with another man, you don't get to have a baby. If neither of you have a womb, you don't get to have a baby. Like, that's just how it works. You simply cannot have a genetic child. Sorry, you're gay. Like, I don't care. That's on you for not owning a womb. And it doesn't give you the right to enslave someone else's. There's also been some cases that I'm not going to talk about gay male couples adopting children or having surrogate babies and not treating them very well. Because gay men are still men at the end of the day. There's a book by Sophie Lewis titled Full Surrogacy now, and since I didn't want to read the whole book, I'm using this Vice article as a reference instead. Side note, there are many things I do not agree with the author of this book on. However, the concept that she presents of full surrogacy is a very interesting one. By full surrogacy, Lewis does not mean commercial or gestational surrogacy, but rather that she believes all birth giving is work because of the immense physical and emotional labor it requires to those who do it. Full surrogacy instead argued that all adult people should play a hand in parenting children, and also that the genetic link between parents and children shouldn't be the foundation of nuclear families. Related to this, I'm reading Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch right now, and it goes into a lot the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Much of women's suppression under capitalism comes down to the fact that sex labor often doesn't actually include women's work as real work. This includes gestation, but also household labor like washing, cooking, and cleaning. She discusses how during the 13th to 14th centuries, wherein landlords commanded serfs, it created a somewhat equal society among the serfdom, surprisingly. Of course, there were still gender differences and oppression, but because the Lord commanded what women did, not their male relatives, it meant that women had more control of the land that was given to them. Land was also passed down in family units rather than through sort of a patriarchal way of being passed down through the males of the family. So it meant that women had more access to the fruits of their labor, and they also had more ownership of the land than they would have under capitalism. Federici writes, since work on the servile farm was organised on a subsistence basis, the sexual division of labour in it was less pronounced and less discriminating than in a capitalist farm. In the feudal village, no social separation existed between the production of goods and the reproduction of the workforce. All work contributed to the family's sustenance. Basically, what she means by this is because there was no wage in a sense of doing a specific kind of work, any work that led to the family being able to live and continue the family line was just work because, there was no payments for specific things. When housework and gestation ceased to be seen as real work that is required to maintain living under capitalism, women were required to engage in this extreme 9-month medical parasitic entity destroying their body, not to sustain the family and community, but because that's just what women do. That's what women did, and that's what they do, and that's what they exist for. When reproductive labor was separated from the need of supporting the family and being on the similar scale of other types of work that just maintained subsistence, it was instead delegated to something that women were supposed to do without payment under capitalism, which also meant that, as I mentioned before, women are unable to survive and have children without proximity to a man who does waged labor to be able to support the family unit. Reproduction became a way in which societies were built. A lot of the ways that capitalism works today would not work if women were paid a wage to have children, but that's not really a good thing either, as we've seen by surrogacy and how it's used as a form of exploitation. As Lewis puts it, the situation is social, not simply natural. Things like this are for political and economic reasons, more specifically capitalist reasons. We made them this way. She then argues for a future where the family unit is abolished, where people in communities care for each other outside of these discrete private units known as families. Even in feudalism, there was a more community sort of element because everyone worked together to maintain this survival, essentially, that it wouldn't be helpful for people to live in these discrete family units, because it was more helpful if all of the community worked together doing different work to maintain everyone's joint survival. Even though land was passed down through family units in the era of serfdom, as Federici discusses, the serfs were essentially forced to have community with each other in the commons. In order to maintain each other's survival, care for each other was necessary. To conclude, most importantly, the concept that links anorexia and surrogacy is the female body, the weakening of the body, the exploitation of the reproductive ability of the body, and how the female body is consistently violated in so many different ways. As a woman, regardless of your class, the fact that you are female, the fact that you have reproductive ability, the fact that femininity is forced onto you are all forms of oppression that essentially lead you to being weakened and unable to participate fully in the same ways that men do. Overall, the body has always been sort of a battleground for women, regardless of where you live, your class, your sort of access to wealth and social status. There's a million other ways this manifests as well. I mean, medical misogyny is a big one. But I feel like even though this isn't a cure-all for women who are being exploited in the third world, especially for women who struggle with eating disorders, anorexia, and body image issues, I feel like feminism is really a way to free yourself from that. Since discovering radical feminism, I care so much less about how I look. I don't really wear makeup anymore. I don't really care about how my body is perceived. But also I feel like it's helped me to focus more on the health side of things rather than sort of how I look doing it. Even at the gym, I'm like only ever focused on like trying to increase the amount of strength I have and also get like a form of enjoyment out of it as well, rather than just being like, yes, I'll be skinny and I'll be more attractive. That's not like my focus anymore. And I feel like it definitely used to be, especially when I was like in my like late teens. So I feel like definitely feminist education is such a way that can help women get out of this sort of focus on thinness. I also think without this focus on anorexia and thinness and the sort of discouragement that comes along with that when you're the 99.99% of women who don't achieve that standard, it's really discouraging, and it leads to other conditions associated with binge eating and overall bad relationship with food, which I think most women have. I don't really talk about in this episode dieting and all of these things that have been happening to women since especially like the mid 1900s, when dieting became such a big thing. Nowadays, even you'll still see videos on TikTok of women being like, what I eat in the day, and it's like 3 pieces of cucumber. And that kind of becomes, again, like a social competition of who can eat the least amount during a day. Of course, the focus instead now for women, which is actually, I would say, becoming a lot better, with the focus on eating more protein and fiber and carbohydrates, just eating more of everything as a woman is a really great thing to see, even though sometimes it can be associated with aesthetics over health. Like inadvertently, it probably still is helping women's health and sort of moving away from this thin standard and more to like having a body that can actually not be fatigued all the time and just like dead and like fucking can't lift like a box off the floor. So I think that is a good thing that I'm seeing, and I'm glad that that's becoming more mainstream, even again if it is associated with aesthetics. If it's making women healthier, then that still has some degree of positivity to it. When it comes to surrogacy, I think feminist education is very helpful in that regard as well. Even just letting people know the conditions that surrogates go through in the third world, and the fact that they're literally enslaved, are unable to leave that job position, and are owned by their commissioning parents during that time, would hopefully reduce the sort of amount of people who are using and purchasing surrogates. But I mean, I don't really think the type of people who are doing that are interested in engaging in feminism anyway. But there is still a hope that that would help reduce the amount of women who are enslaved into this sort of breeder class. So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. I've probably like cut out me coughing and blowing my nose like 500 times in this episode. But that's okay. I hope it was worth me recording it anyway, even though I'm sick. And if I'm honest, there might not be another episode for another 6 months. So see you guys in 6 months. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a good week, and bye.